Yes, my name is Archimandrite Cyril Hovorun. I'm Ukrainian. I worked for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I'm an Orthodox priest. At the moment, I work in Los Angeles as an acting director of Huffington Ecumenical Institute and a professor at Loyola Marymount University in this city. So I teach and I do some work to promote Christian unity, rapprochement between different groups of Christians. And I'm very happy in Ukraine recently it was announced that there were steps undertaken jointly by the church and by the government to facilitate a similar rapprochement between the Orthodox, because we struggle to get closer with other Christian groups, I mean, between Orthodox and Catholics, Protestants, and so forth. But sometimes we can't understand common language. We don't speak common language with our Orthodox brethren. That's why it's bizarre, and I'm very glad that we made, and hopefully will make some steps towards one another. It's not a novelty. It's not something new. Not something that that is unexpected, because this story is at least 1 century long. The story of reconciliation between Orthodox and the story of the Ukrainian Orthodox getting more independence in their church life. I would say that this story began with the independence of the Ukrainian state, but even before that, on the eve of the Russian Revolution, tendencies towards more autonomy for the Ukrainian Orthodox began. Unfortunately, the expectations and aspirations of the Ukrainians who tried to flee first the Russian Empire, then the Soviet New Empire, were not fulfilled, because the Ukrainian state did not live for a long time. And even though the Ukrainian state facilitated the process of autonomization or autocephalization of the Ukrainian church, because the state did not last for a long time, and the Soviet regime that occupied Ukraine stopped any attempt of the Ukrainian Orthodox to get independence, because the Soviet regime was atheistic. And the attempts were relaunched after Ukraine got independence. That happened immediately, coincided chronologically with the independence of the Ukrainian state. And it didn't go well, in the sense that a part of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy proclaimed itself autocephalous. Another part remained in union with the Moscow Patriarchate. And exactly this became a reason for a schism, sort of split. It's not exactly, well, you can put it like a schism, a split between within the Orthodox community in Ukraine, so that at least 3 jurisdictions exist nowadays. The largest one is the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Church in union with the Moscow Patriarchate, then the independent jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Kiev, and then the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which continued the existence of the Ukrainian Church in diaspora, mostly in the United States and Canada. It is a sort of reincarnation of the Ukrainian church in diaspora. It's a tiny church nowadays, Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, and it constitutes a third player, as it were, in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. So for a long time, those 3 groups lived separately from one another. There was, unfortunately, more than enough hostility between them. A rhetoric of hatred, sometimes a rhetoric of separation, of divisions. Nowadays, the division between the Orthodox is used, unfortunately, plays a role in the Russian aggression against Ukraine, because I believe Russia plays with this division, this separation. And nowadays, the church issue became also which used to be a church issue for a long time. Nowadays it became an issue of national security and of politics. So that's the background of the story. I would say there was an attempt, a bold attempt to get an independence for the Ukrainian Church with the assistance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate exactly 10 years ago in 28, in the year 2008, under President Yushchenko, who initiated and facilitated the process of recognition of the independent part of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Unfortunately, at that time, the attempt failed, and now we witness a second attempt. Though I would say that nowadays the logic, the rationale of the second attempt is different than the rationale of the attempt that happened 10 years ago. If you want me, I could explore this in more detail. Yes. So at the time I was in Ukraine, I was a chair of the Ecumenical Office of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow Patriarchate. So let me explain a bit the difference between the attempt 10 years ago in 2008 and what is happening now. I was a witness of the events 10 years ago because at the time I was in Ukraine and I was chair of the Ecumenical Office of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I mean, the church under the Moscow Patriarchate. And I had the chance to participate, to be involved directly with the attempts to establish or re-establish the union between the Ecumenical Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Church at that time. I should say that at that time, the initiative, the process was initiated by the president at the time, Yushchenko, and he played a key role. He was he decided himself what he would do. He conducted negotiations, and it was clearly a political initiative by him. He had his own ideas, his own projects. He tried to impose those ideas upon the church figures. I remember very well how he tried to persuade Patriarch Filaret of the Kiev Patriarchate to accept his model of relations. And another important feature of the attempt 10 years ago was that President Yushchenko at the time envisaged a single local church for Ukraine. He wanted all the branches of the Ukrainian to be united into one church. This is the so-called the idea of locality. One state should have one church, which implicitly presupposed that this church would be under some sort of significant control of the state, I would say. Nowadays, the situation is quite different. Indeed, a facilitator of the process is President Poroshenko, and I should say that he hesitated for a long time to step into this process. I know for quite sure that after the year 2014, many times he was urged, he was encouraged by different players in Ukraine mostly, including the churches, to deal with the church issue. As I explained, this issue turned from ecclesial to political, to sometimes to the issue of national security. And there were different ideas and proposals how to deal with this situation. I should say that Poroshenko postponed most of the suggestions and projects. He did not interfere to the ecclesial matters in Ukraine. I think he missed a lot of opportunities because of that. And only now he decided to step in. And again, I wouldn't say that the initiative is his. His initiative is to support the initiative that had been proposed, that had been made. And those initiatives come from the churches primarily, from the Ukrainian churches. And nowadays it's not just the church of the Kiev Patriarchate, which is a protagonist of the process, certainly. But the initiatives come also from many faithful who belong or belonged and cannot belong anymore to the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. That is one thing, that the churches play a protagonistic role in the present situation. They force, they urge the president to act, and the president hesitated for a long time. It's quite different from the situation with Yushchenko, who played this protagonistic role himself, and sometimes he went ahead of the churches in his initiatives, I would say. So the second moment, the second feature that I'd like to highlight is that the model which is discussed nowadays and which is to be hopefully implemented now does not presuppose a one local church for Ukraine. It presupposes a multiple jurisdiction. It presupposes a more diversity in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. The president clearly stated that he doesn't want to unite all the Orthodox Christians in Ukraine into one church. He would allow, of course, he cannot do it otherwise, those who want to stay in the Moscow Patriarchate to stay there. And those who want to join the independent Ukrainian church would be able to join the independent Ukrainian church, which is a dramatic difference, a huge difference if you compare this model, this present model, with the model of Yushchenko. Nowadays we are talking about not about establishing a single local church for Ukraine, but about creation of a canonical alternative to the existent canonical church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It means that there will be at least two canonical churches, jurisdictions in Ukraine. They will have diversity. They will have, the Ukrainian Orthodoxy will be more diverse, more, and I believe more sustainable, if you allow me to say, because it seems that the model of one church will not work for Ukraine for a long time. There will be always people, and a considerable number of people, who will want to stay with the Moscow Patriarchate. We cannot change this in foreseeable future, at least. And those people will have a chance to stay with the jurisdiction they want to stay with. And those at the same time who don't want to stay in that jurisdiction will have a chance to change it. I think it will be a great relief for many people who face a very difficult dilemma while staying in the Moscow Patriarchate, because many of them understand, and we are talking about millions, I would say, many of them understand the importance of the recognition of legitimacy for an ecclesial jurisdiction, that canonicity matters. It is important that the church is recognized. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, there is no alternative to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, and those people who understand the role that the Russian church played in the aggression against Ukraine, that it continues playing, this policy of keeping blind eye on the aggression, on the war, on the tragedies that occur in the East, from the leadership, on behalf of the leadership of the Ukrainian church with the Moscow Patriarchate, really discourages people to stay there, but they don't have an alternative. And I know quite a number of those people, and they have either to, swallow it and to live with this, and it produces a huge trauma for them, or just to leave this church and to go to another jurisdiction, to go to the Greek Catholic Church, or to go nowhere. Some of them just leave the church. So I think this model, I believe it is more viable for Ukraine. It's more adequate for Ukraine. And it will also, I would like to emphasize this, keep the Ukrainian Orthodoxy more self-sufficient and non-dependent on the state. There will be no state church. I think for the church it is important. Maybe it's not very good for the state because, well, the state has its own political purposes, but from the perspective of the church, it is important that the church preserves some sort of distance from the state. And this pluralism, I would say, canonical jurisdictional pluralism in Ukraine will preserve, I believe, some distance, important distance, between the church and the state. Some people disregard this canonical aspect of the ecclesial life. They just join the Kiev Patriarchate regardless of its recognition of its canonical status. For some people, it is still an issue, and some people who are very much, sympathize with Ukraine, who love Ukraine, who struggle for Ukraine, they still can't go to the Kiev Patriarchate because the problem of canonicity remains for them. And this for many, it is a serious obstacle. So this obstacle will be removed if a part of the Ukrainian church will be granted independence, autocephaly, and that part of the church would be completely supportive of the Ukrainian cause and would extend its power, would kind of extend its relief to consciousness of people who cannot bear this burden of belonging to a jurisdiction that they know participate and consent with killing Ukrainians and the aggression. That's exactly, it was the case, absolutely. You were told absolutely correctly. The Church of Kievan Rus was incorporated to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and it remained an intrinsic part of the ecumenical patriarchate for most of its history. If we compare the period of time when the Kievan Church existed under ecumenical patriarchate with the period of time when it belonged to other jurisdictions like Moscow, the Constantinopolitan period is much longer than the Moscow period, as it were. And what happened, it's interesting that after the destruction of Kiev in the 13th century by the Mongol hordes, and before that there was, an attempt to destruct Kiev by Andrei Bogolyubsky, and essentially the Church of Kiev was fragmented, became split into two pieces. I use a word, it was cloned somehow, like two clones of the Church of Kiev, so that one part of the Kievan Church moved towards what is now Russia, to Muscovy, and another part was incorporated to the Lithuanian and Polish state. And at that time, a split occurred, a schism occurred between those two parts of the Kievan Church, just like what we have today. But at that time, the parts were different. So that the part that moved to Moscow declared schism with the ecumenical patriarchate and remained in the situation of schism, non-canonical schism, for over a century. That part that remained with the Patriarchate of Constantinople was the only canonical church on the territory of modern Ukraine. And now they swapped their roles, as it were, so that the part which belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate is now canonical, and it has been recognized by all churches. We should admit it. That is kind of a matter of fact. And the part which now wants to become a part of to be in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople is now in the situation of schism with the global Orthodoxy. That is a matter of fact. This is a situation which emerged only recently, after the declaration of independence of Ukraine. I should probably make another footnote, a very brief footnote, that after the first attempt of the Ukrainian independence in the beginning, in the 20s, in the end, after the Russian Revolution, 1917, and establishing of the Ukrainian People's Republic, at that time, a part of the Ukrainian church that fled together with immigrants to Canada and the United States, that part of the Ukrainian church remained mostly outside communion with other churches, and it was incorporated by the Patriarchate of Constantinople only recently in the 90s, first in Canada and then in the United States. So it demonstrates that for people who wanted their independence, ecclesial independence, who wanted their autocephaly, it was important to preserve canonicity, even if they are in the situation of kind of split or schism, if you want. They want this canonicity. This is a very healthy token, I believe. This is a very healthy indication. Even now, as you know, the Patriarchate of Kiev, it seeks recognition from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which is a very good token, I think, because it means that they don't want to stay where they are. They don't want to preserve status quo because they realize that this status quo is not sufficient for them to be a church in the full sense. And it is a token of healthy ecclesial consciousness, I would say. On the other side, I observe a rather unhealthy tendency. I mean the tendency, the side of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. The Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine for a long time accused the Patriarchate of Kiev of being non-canonical, and they used this non-canonical status to blame people, to develop hatred, to develop kind of hate speech against them. A whole narrative, rhetoric of hatred, of rejection, of exclusion developed in Ukraine on the grounds of canonicity. And what is happening now, I believe, is sometimes what is happening to people. Sometimes we turn to what we blame, to what we accuse. It affects us eventually, and that's what is happening, I believe, to the Patriarchate of Moscow in Ukraine. That while accusing the Patriarchate of Kiev of staying in this situation of schism, accusing of being of neglecting, ignoring canonical aspects, the Ukrainian Church under Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine seems to be sliding into the same direction, What I mean, I will explain. It seems, and this is, I think, important. I think it is an important warning. It seems that the unity of the Orthodox churches, the idea of belonging to the global family of the Orthodox churches is not very much important for the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. They use this unity as an argument against Kiev Patriarchate. But now, when a possibility of the Kiev Patriarchate to join this family of global churches is coming, the Moscow Patriarchate is frightened. They didn't want this to happen. And there is another thing which is happening within the Moscow Patriarchate. It's a tendency to isolation, to self-imposed isolation within Ukraine and outside Ukraine. Under the current leadership, the Ukrainian Church with the Moscow Patriarchate tends to support marginal movements in the global Orthodoxy, especially fundamentalistic movements, radical conservatives, sometimes just crazy people. They are troublemakers for the global Orthodoxy, and unfortunately, sometimes the leadership of the Ukrainian Church support those people. Those people whom they support, they have a very sectarian mentality, I would say, and this mentality penetrates the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, especially as regards the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. This mentality also affects the perception of the church. Now, I hear arguments from that side of the church in Ukraine like this, that any canonical autocephaly, even if it is granted canonically, even if it is granted in the same way as it was granted to Moscow, for instance, long time ago, 600 years ago, this canonical autocephaly would be wrong, would not heal the schism, would not heal the split, would create further divisions. And moreover, some even hierarchs, even metropolitans, I can mention only one example of Metropolitan Archangel of Odessa. He repeats that even if we are granted canonical autocephaly, this will lead us to splitting from the Church of Christ. This will lead us to, perishing eternally, to condemnation of our souls, which is absurd, which is nonsense. It is a heresy. It is an ecclesiological heresy. That's a heresy when people believe that administrative restructuring of the church can affect the nature of the church. And this idea is widely, increasingly spread in Ukraine. This is an unhealthy idea. This is a schismatic, kind of sectarian idea. And that is what is affecting now the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, I'm afraid. There is another moment that I would like to underline. People tend to confuse the church with themselves, especially the leaders of the church, leadership of the church. They believe that whatever they speak on behalf, whatever they say on behalf of the church, reflects what the church indeed wants, reflects the kind of fundamental needs of the church. They identify the church with themselves. They also identify the church with the structures. They want to preserve structures in Ukraine. They want to preserve their dioceses, they want to preserve their properties. They don't care about people. People leave the church. The church has already shrunk, and they don't notice it. They only notice, they don't care about preservation of structures. And this is a completely wrong idea about the church. That is probably one of the wrongest ideas about the church. And this idea is widely spread in that group in Ukraine that resists Autocephaly of the Ukrainian church. Well, I believe there will be an increasing pressure from Moscow to stop, or at least to impede, the process of independence, of granting independence to the Ukrainian church. That is, I'm absolutely sure about that. I should probably explain this in the context of interests of the, as it were, stakeholders of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. We can understand the interests of Poroshenko, who now tries to improve his ratings and approval ratings and so forth. That is understandable. Probably has some sincere interest in achieving this as well. I don't know what is in his mind and soul. Let us put it aside. What is his interest? Certainly, the interest of the Patriarchate of Kiev is to get recognized. This is a very good and healthy interest. They recognize some deficiency that they have. That is obvious. Otherwise, they would not go into that direction. It's difficult for me to judge the intentions, the rationale of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but I could probably reveal some things. I know quite for sure. I will not tell you why, how, but I know it for sure that his concern is primarily pastoral. He understands that many Ukrainian Orthodox have experienced this kind of burden of consciousness of belonging to a church that is not with the Ukrainian cause, with the Ukrainian people sometimes. Again, I don't want to generalize the Ukrainian church, about the Ukrainian church. It's very diverse, and there are many good people who support Ukraine and so forth, but it's a different question. I know that for many people it is, as I explained earlier, it is a burden to belong to the church. They either leave or they suffer. I think Patriarch Bartholomew understands this, and he wants to give a pastoral solution to help those people to find their way to reconcile with their consciousness, to be happy in the church again, as it were. Of course, he also wants to emphasize, again, to strengthen the role of the Ecumenical Patriarchate among the Orthodox churches. I don't think that he aspires to increase the number of his faithful by adding Ukraine to it, because we are not talking about granting the Ukrainian church a sort of autonomous status under the Ecumenical Patriarchate. We are talking about independence of the Ukrainian church, which means that the Patriarchate of Constantinople will get nothing in terms of numbers, right? So I think his intentions are pastoral. They're very good. Speaking about the intentions of the Ukrainian church, of the Moscow Patriarchate, it's very complicated. Speaking about the leadership, I think the leadership is gets influenced first of all by Moscow. Moscow has its own intentions to preserve empire. Look, Putin cannot act in Ukraine directly nowadays. Of course, he still can bribe people, he still can force people to do what he wants. There are many his agents in Ukraine in different on different layers of political life and so forth. But he cannot act institutionally in Ukraine. The only institution that he can use is the church. And unfortunately, the church agreed to be used by political forces. The church, the cause of Autocephaly for the Russian church is primarily the cause of preservation of the empire, of this neo-Soviet new empire that Putin tries to build. And Autocephaly is certainly an instrument. It's the only institutionalized presence of Russia in Ukraine nowadays. So as when it comes to the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, it tries to accommodate the instructions and wishes of Moscow, certainly, but not only that, because the structure of wishes and instructions that the Ukrainian Church receives is very complicated, is complex. A substantial element in this complex of instructions and impulses, I would say, come from Moscow, but not only from Moscow, but also from some political parties in Ukraine. And I believe what we are experiencing now is another attempt of some Ukrainian political parties to use the church issues, the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, for their own purposes. I mean primarily the so-called the party, the bloc of opposition, Opposition bloc, the former Party of Regions. They have a very long tradition of using the Ukrainian Church for their own purposes in different electoral circles, as it were. Now the new electoral circle is approaching in 1 year approximately, and they will certainly use the Ukrainian Church for their own purpose. Their purpose is to get some revenge in the presidential and parliamentary elections. They want certainly to target the president of Ukraine. They work in the paradigm of polarization. They cannot work in the paradigm of reconciliation in the Ukrainian society. They work only in the paradigm of polarization, and they induce this paradigm upon the church. And the rhetoric that we hear from the church, from the leadership of the church, is a rhetoric of polarization, is a rhetoric of counterposition of the church to the rest of the Ukrainian society. And that is a problem, because I can understand, it doesn't mean that I can accept, but I can understand the logic, the wishes, rationale of the opposition bloc of this party in Ukraine. They want some political kind of gain for themselves. But I don't understand why the church would need it itself. And what this political party does in order to, to fight against the president, against the political authorities in Ukraine, when it comes to the church, it translates into the fight of the church against the society, the Ukrainian society. We see how the church distances itself from the society, how the church, through its leaders, through its speakers, condemns everything positive which is happening in the Ukrainian society. This is not healthy. I understand that the church can criticize authorities and should criticize properly, should raise its prophetic voice, but the church cannot slide to a sort of paranoia, to a sort of self-isolation, to a sort of hysteria, because we're observing this sort of hysteria. This can serve the interests of the church leadership in Ukraine nowadays, but it doesn't judge the majority of the church people, of the hierarchs, of the bishops, of the priests, of the ordinary people. They don't want this kind of confrontation with the society. They don't see the point. Why? I see the point why some leaders in this church can do it, because they get, paid by some oligarchs. And that is another interesting issue. Oligarchs. I think it is helpful to understand, to explain the Ukrainian situation in the terms of symphonic relationship between the church and the state. Symphony is a Byzantine paradigm of the relationships, as you know, and it survived even the separation between the church and the state. The Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate tried to develop and try to have symphonic relationship with, say, regime of Kuchma, with the regime of Yanukovych. It failed. Now what they try to do is a different sort of symphony, which I would identify as a symphony with some oligarchs, with oligarchate. I know the situation inside the Ukrainian church for many years now. I was very closely involved in the life of this church for many years, and I always observed quite a few oligarchs trying to get closer to the church and maybe to use the church for their own purposes. But I never experienced the extent of this use and abuse of the church by oligarchs, and as I see it now. It's extraordinary. Essentially, what we observe now, maybe it's not very much visible to the external observers, but what I can observe now is the church being essentially kind of a hostage, being captivated by an oligarch who promotes his own political agenda. He's quite hopeful to become the next president. It's a crazy idea, I know, but he's hopeful. And he now runs the church, essentially. And he imposes upon... Yes, this is the Moscow Patriarchate, and I'm talking about a very particular person, Vadim Novinsky. He tries essentially to impose his own agenda, political agenda, upon the church, and unfortunately the leadership of the church accepts this agenda. For instance, for me, a very telling episode was then that while this church never issued a statement about the war, about the sufferings of people, not a single statement about the events that have shaken the entire world, but not the church. It remained silent, and only when the Ukrainian justice tried to start a sort of investigation, legal investigation against Novinsky, the church issued a public statement in his support. That was very telling for me about the priorities and about the way how this church is managed nowadays and ruled. So I think I would distinguish very strongly between the interests of some leaders of this church and the rest of the church. I think it is not in the interest of the church to support these policies, this politics towards polarization and isolation. This policy, however, it certainly fits this party of regents. But it also fits the Moscow propaganda about Ukraine, because Moscow now tries to use this idea of persecutions, as it were, against the church, which is nonsense, because there are no persecutions. What we are talking about is that every single institution in Ukraine should be equal before law, in front of law. That is the only thing they try to impose, and they call it persecution. I think this is a manipulation. It has nothing to do with persecutions. They artificially create an atmosphere of hysteria, of paranoia, if you want, and that's why they are so much against the process of normalization of situation in Ukraine through autocephaly, because autocephaly will contribute to normalization of the church life in Ukraine. They don't want this normalization. Yes, I think it will mean a lot for the Ukrainian churches in the US, in Canada, and elsewhere in the world. It will mean that the Ukrainian church will be less fragmented. Well, it can be still divided jurisdictionally, but jurisdictional divisions are just administrative divisions. They are nothing. They don't touch the essence, the substance of the church. It means that in substance, we will be one church. That is very important. We will be less divided. We will be less polarized. We will be more secure, I would say. We will be closer, much closer in Jesus Christ to one another, because we will partake of the same chalice. So I would not. I think it is very difficult to overestimate the consequences of such step.